we started into this section of Isaiah chapter 7, that we're going to be looking at kind of our Christmas series through this lens of Isaiah 7 through 9. But to do so, we really need to understand the historical background. So we started that last Sunday with an understanding of the background of this passage. This prophecy is grounded in history, and the same characters that we talked about last week are going to come into play today for the most part. The northern kingdom under King Pekah had allied themselves with Aram under King Rezin, the kingdom that is just northeast of them. And they've combined their forces and come against the southern kingdom of Judah, hoping to kind of fold them into their alliance, even if by force. So we looked at this map last week, and if you look at that, the green and the blue portions in that upper quadrant of the map, those two groups have kind of come together and are coming against the salmon portion in the lower middle section of the map there. Ahaz, who is a descendant of David, the king of Judah, along with his subjects, they're trembling with fear, like trees shaking in the wind. But God sends a message through Isaiah the prophet encouraging Judah to trust him. Pekah, Rezin. God says, don't worry about those two smoldering twigs. All their threats will come to nothing. You don't have to worry about them. And God's assurance builds to this stirring affirmation when he says, if you do not stand firm in your faith, you will not stand at all. Two options. You stand firm in faith, or you sway, you teeter, you ultimately fall in your doubts. So that's where we left off last week. Unfortunately, instead of trusting God, Ahaz comes up with another plan. Between these two extremes of standing firm in your faith and not standing at all, Ahaz is trying to thread the needle to some other option. And this happens when we're fearful. We feel pressure to come up with a solution, something that we can do. And trusting God that sometimes feels too passive in the face of such urgent circumstances. So, many times, in the face of that, we instead scurry about looking for some sort of solution. And that's the way that Ahaz feels in this. So what do you do when you're a king and your people are under attack and you feel like you can't withstand that attack? Well, the natural solution is to look for an ally, someone that you can partner with, someone who might tip the scales of power in your favor. So, Judah can't stand against Israel and Aram united, but maybe he can if he has someone else on his side. We know that this is what Ahaz is wrestling with. And his solution is to reach out to Assyria and ask them for help. And understand that Assyria is the expanding world power at this time. They are this up-and-coming empire. And likely this is the real reason that Israel and Aram have united and are intent on folding Judah into their alliance. They need to prepare to stand against the real threat that's on the horizon, the Assyrians coming. And Judah's refusal to kind of join in on that is probably a calculated decision. To stand against Assyria is a risky bet. If they lose, they'll be wiped out. And even with a trifold alliance, their victory is certainly not assured. So Ahaz decides that instead of lining up with Israel and Aram, he will try to bargain with Assyria. And 2 Kings chapter 16 fills in the story for us a little bit. We find out in 2 Kings 16:7, Ahaz sent messengers to say to Tiglath-Pileser, king of Assyria, I am your servant and vassal. Come up and save me out of the hand of the king of Aram and of the king of Israel, who are attacking me. This is not a partnership of equals. Ahaz is coming to Assyria as a vassal, a subservient posture of basically surrender. And proof of his earnestness is seen in the riches that he sends to convince Assyria to side with him. The passage goes on and says, "And Ahaz took the silver and gold found in the temple of the Lord and in the treasuries of the royal palace and sent it as a gift to the king of Assyria. He drains the royal treasury and the precious articles of the temple in order to procure Tiglath-Pileser's favor." Now, can you imagine when Tiglath-Pileser gets word that Judah would like to pay him exorbitant amounts of money to convince him to do what he already had in mind to do anyway? I mean, he is expanding his kingdom, stretching his reach further and further. And Aram and Israel, those would be strategic victories for him on his way to dominance. And now, he'll get paid for the favor. One commentator said, "This is like three mice fighting, Aram, Israel, and Judah. And one of them, Judah, hiring the cat and opening the door for the predator to come on in." But that's Ahaz's solution. To the alternatives of standing by faith or not standing at all, he adds a third option: to stand with Assyria. And he's made up his mind. And this is all the backdrop of this encounter between Isaiah and Ahaz. Likely, Ahaz has already sent word to Tiglath-Pileser when God invites him in Isaiah chapter 7, verse 11, to ask for a sign, confirmation of his trustworthiness. All these promises that he'd given in the previous verses, that those two kings were like smoldering sticks and not to be worried about. Well, if you want proof that God can be trusted to bring that victory, well, he invites Ahaz to ask for a sign. No limits on the sign that could be given. He can ask from the deepest depths or the highest heights. Literally, it says, from deep as Sheol to high as the heavens. There are no limits. Ask whatever you want as a sign of God's trustworthiness. Ahaz refuses with what sounds like great piety. "I will not ask. I will not put the Lord to the test." Which sounds really good. We know in Deuteronomy 6:16 that we're forbidden from putting God to the test. Jesus himself uses this reasoning when he resists Satan's temptation, refuses to throw himself down from the temple to see if God will protect him. But of course, Jesus' refusal is kind of out of a confidence in his Lord. And Ahaz's refusal, well, that's a stubborn resistance to inviting God's confirmation that he has offered. He doesn't want to trust God. He already has his own plan of how to solve this conundrum. He has already shelled out a fortune to help secure that help. To find out now that that was unnecessary, well, that would be an embarrassment. Isaiah says that Ahaz is trying the patience of God. His refusal to ask for a sign, that's not piety, that's rebellion. God's fed up. So he will give a sign anyway. So here it is. Isaiah chapter 7, verse 14. "Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. The virgin will conceive and give birth to a son, and you will call him Immanuel." This is one of the great verses in the Bible, and one of the epic declarations. One of the most familiar prophecies of Christmas. Matthew himself ties this to the birth of Jesus. So that should settle it. This is a prophecy of Christmas. But if all of this is pointing to Christ, then what do we do with verse 16, which says, "For before the boy," this son that's going to be named Immanuel, For this boy knows enough to reject the wrong and choose the right. The land of the two kings that you dread will be laid waste. The child's maturing conscience is it's like the temporal marker of when the destruction of these two kings will take place. Before this child is able to discern wrong and right, the threat that Ahaz fears will be gone. The age of accountability in Judaism is 13. Of course, it's marked nowadays with a bar mitzvah. The boy is considered to have become a man. So that would be understood as the time when the boy could make this decision between wrong and right, have moral discernment. So this sign is basically saying that within 14 years, 13 years of life and adding a year for gestation, these two kingdoms that Ahaz fears, Israel and Aram, they'll be destroyed. And of course, this squares with history. 3 years after this prophecy, Damascus, which is the capital of the nation of Aram, was destroyed by the Assyrians. And then 10 years after that, Samaria, which is the capital of the northern kingdom of Israel, was defeated by the Assyrians. So this child referred to in this passage must be conceived soon after this prophecy is delivered for it to make sense as a marker of when these two kings will be destroyed. And of course, this is 700 years before the birth of Christ. So who is this child born to a virgin? All right, well, first I need to explain that word translated virgin is filled with uncertainty. The NIV, the version that I typically use in my preaching, they have a footnote on that. And the footnote says that another option, as translating that, is young woman. Even that's not ideal, because there is a specific word in Hebrew for virgin that is not used here. And there is a specific word in Hebrew for young woman that's not used here either. Instead, there is this intentionally ambiguous word that's used. It's typically used of a woman who is sexually matured but not married. Our closest English equivalent, though we don't use it a lot now, is the word maiden. But why does God leave this ambiguity? I mean, if God meant a young woman, why not use that Hebrew word? And if God meant a virgin, why not use that word? I think because this ambiguity allows this prophecy to go in two directions in its interpretation. Fulfillment on the near horizon and fulfillment on the far horizon. I mean, is this a prophecy of a child in Ahaz's generation? Or is it a prophecy of the Messiah born 700 years later? I think it's both. If you're familiar with my understanding of prophecy, and I have talked about this before, you know that I'm not entirely comfortable with a strictly linear understanding. Prophecy leading to fulfillment. One to one, a clear line drawn from the one to the other. Because in many cases, fulfillment of prophecy comes in stages and in degrees. And there may be a fulfillment on the near horizon, and then further into the future, there may be another fulfillment. And that is in no way unique to just this prophecy here in Isaiah 7:14. So with that understanding, who is the fulfillment on the near horizon? I mean, who is Ahaz going to notice as this child who's a marker of when the kings that he fears, Pekah and Rezin, will be destroyed before that child reaches a point of moral maturity? Well, I think that the best answer to that is Hezekiah, who's Ahaz's son. He's born to a maiden, and he might appropriately be called Immanuel, God with us. last week there was this important detail in the verses that we covered that I intentionally just kind of skimmed over because it wasn't really relevant last week, but it is relevant this week. So I want to draw your attention to it. When Isaiah approaches Ahaz and challenges him not to be fearful, but to trust God, to not worry about the two kings that are threatening him, Rezin and Pekin, the location of that encounter between Isaiah and Ahaz is important. He meets Ahaz, according to Isaiah 7:3, at the aqueduct of the upper pool on the road to the launderer's field. That's really specific. And last week we did talk about the fact that the king is examining the water system at the time, probably their greatest vulnerability to foreign attack. And feeling that vulnerability, he's going to be challenged to trust God, to believe that God can bring deliverance in that. Of course, we know that he's going to fail that test. Instead, trusting God, he's going to turn to Assyria and ask Tiglath-Pileser to come to his rescue. But this same location comes up one other time in the book of Isaiah. And this time, when Hezekiah is king, Ahaz's son. Isaiah chapter 36, verse 1. In the 14th year of King Hezekiah's reign, Sennacherib, king of Assyria, attacked all the fortified cities of Judah and captured them. Again, a king of Judah is facing military pressure from the Assyrians. And Judah's defenses are failing. And we find out that there are many fortified cities of Judah that have already fallen at this point. And Assyria, whom Hezekiah's father Ahaz had turned to for help, is now turning against them. And the second greatest kingdom in Judah, the city of Lachish, has just been defeated by the Assyrians. So, the real question on Hezekiah's mind is, will Jerusalem, the capital, the greatest city of their kingdom, will that suffer the same fate? Because every other fortified cities that he has in Judah has already been destroyed by the Assyrians. And then this part, verse 2 of Isaiah 36, then the king of Assyria sent his field commander with a large army from Lachish to Hezekiah at Jerusalem. And the commander stopped, listen to the location, at the aqueduct of the upper pool on the road to the launderer's field. Same location as when Ahaz faced a test of trust. It's like a redo. Where Ahaz fails to trust the Lord, Hezekiah now has an opportunity. And he will succeed. Listen to the words of his prayer in the next chapter, Isaiah 37. Feeling the threat of the Assyrians breathing down his neck. It's true, Lord, that the Assyrian kings have laid waste to all these people and their lands. They have thrown their gods into the fire and destroyed them, for they were not gods, but only wood and stone, fashioned by human hands. Now, Lord our God, deliver us from his hand, so that all the kingdoms of earth may know that you, Lord, are the only God. The gods of all these other conquered people have not been able to help these neighboring nations withstand the onslaught of the Assyrians. The Assyrians have rolled through and tossed those gods of the defeated people into the fire. Of course, that would be the case because those gods aren't really gods. They're just blocks of wood or chunks of stone. Hezekiah sees this as Yahweh's opportunity to demonstrate that he is different from all of that. He's not just a block of wood or a chunk of stone, that he is the only God. So Hezekiah will trust God to bring deliverance, to exalt the glory of his own name, despite the fact that no other God has come through for the other nations around them. Because Hezekiah believes that his God is the only true God. So do you think that it's fitting to call Hezekiah Immanuel? God with us? His bold trust that God will bring deliverance, that God will prove that he is the only true God, that leads to slaughter in the Assyrian camp overnight. We find out an angel of the Lord goes through the camp and kills 85,000 of the Assyrians. And the next day, the Assyrians break camp and they return home. Mathematically, Judah stood no chance against the Assyrians. But God is with them in a way that he was not with the other nations that got steamrolled by the Assyrians. And Hezekiah is able to demonstrate in a way that Ahaz could not, because Ahaz failed to trust God. Hezekiah, he did. He trusted God. And God brought deliverance. So Hezekiah will display God's presence with his people when he trusts God where Ahaz failed. But of course, before that, he will grow from infancy to maturity. And before he reaches that milestone, the kings that Ahaz fears so greatly, they'll be gone. They'll be gone. The immediate threat that he feels, it won't last. That's good news, right? I mean, all their fearsome foes overcome. Well, sort of, but the passage goes on to say that there's a bigger problem. Aram and Israel won't be anymore. But there is this ominous warning. The Lord will bring on you and on your people and the house of your father a time unlike any since Ephraim broke away from Judah. He will bring the king of Assyria. Judah is so worried about Israel and Aram that he is not seeing the real threat. Oh, Assyria? No worries, that's our ally. Well, the rest of the chapter is just highlighting the devastation that alliance will bring. The Lord will whistle, it says, summoning flies from Egypt and bees from Assyria. They'll come swarming. They will settle in every crack and crevice. They will overrun the land. Throughout its history, Israel has kind of been caught between the civilizations of Egypt in the south and the Mesopotamian Valley in the east. And Isaiah sees these two superpowers, Egypt and Assyria. Oh, those are just insects, flies and bees. And they're summoned by their master's whistle, the Lord. They come at God's command. In 720, the metaphor changes from insect to razor. The point's the same. Assyria doesn't come on its own volition. They're the agent of God. They're a tool in God's hand. A razor hired from beyond the Euphrates. And he will shave Judah bare. The NIV says, your head and your private parts. And this is not a passage that we teach in children's church. Literally, it says the hair on your head and the hair on your legs. And that combination may just suggest totality from top to bottom. But the legs were often used as a euphemism for genitalia. In either way, this is complete humiliation, the degradation of being shaved bald. This is what God will do to the land. He'll shave it bare with the razor of Assyria. Goes on to say that in that day a person will keep a young goat or a young cow and 2 goats. That's a really meager flock. This is an indication of economic devastation. They're going to give abundant milk because the population is so depleted. Curds and honey. This is their crop because all the harvestable fields are going to lay fallow. They're going to begin to return to wilderness. Briars and thorns are mentioned over and over again in these verses. Valuable vineyards will be reduced to briars and thorns. The land will be good for nothing but hunting. Wilderness, it's going to be like a refuge for wild game. Cultivated fields will be just wilderness again. Fearful places with overgrown foliage. And the cattle, they'll have plenty to graze on. Everywhere they turn, there's going to be bushes. You see what's happening. So-called solution that Ahaz comes up with will be his nation's undoing. Assyria will come like a buzzing bee, like flies swarming the land, like a razor shaving you bald. And this too is Immanuel. God with us. For Hezekiah, who will choose to trust God, the promise of his proximity, his nearness, that's great news. When Sennacherib is breathing down his neck, he's glad to have God present in a way that the wooden and stone gods of the neighboring nations were not present with their people. And the angel of the Lord will come and slay thousands of Assyrians overnight and turn them on their heels. But for Ahaz, who's chosen to turn away from the Lord, this promised proximity, God with us, that's not assured. God will get up in his business, and he won't like it. Like bees and flies that God summons with a whistle to swarm every corner of the land. Oh, this is intimate, but not the intimacy of a warm embrace. This is the intimacy of God shaving your private parts with a razor. Okay, that's not usually how we think of Immanuel. But understand that God's nearness, his proximity, God with us, can be a source of great comfort, as it would be for Hezekiah. But it can also be a cause of great distress, as it is for Ahaz. And of course we know. We know that this sign of a child named Immanuel means more than just the birth of Hezekiah, though I think it does mean that on the near horizon. Matthew makes clear that there is a bigger fulfillment. And so in Matthew chapter 1:18, this is how the birth of Jesus the Messiah came about. His mother Mary was pledged to be married to Joseph. But before they came together, she was found to be pregnant through the Holy Spirit. And then down into verse 22 and 23, all this took place to fulfill what the Lord had said through the prophet, the virgin will conceive and give birth to a son, and they will call him Immanuel, which means God with us. And of course here, there is no ambiguity, because Matthew is quoting from the Septuagint, a Greek translation of the Old Testament. And in that Greek translation, there is no ambiguity in that word. The word there is virgin, clearly. And Matthew understands it that way. So is Hezekiah the Messiah? Well, sort of. He is an anointed king of Judah in the line of David. He's a good king who follows the Lord and is commended for it. He does bring the presence of God to bear on the affairs of the nation in a way that few kings had in their history. Because of his trust in the Lord, he's able to turn back the mighty Assyrian army who had laid waste to all the people and their lands previously. He brings deliverance to his people, but it's limited. 120 years later, now the Babylonians, not the Assyrians anymore, but the Babylonians will come through and defeat them. Judah will be sent into exile. So there must be more. This can't be the full import of the prophecy. Of course, 700 years later, a virgin conceives, gives birth to a son who is God in the flesh. God with us in a far more profound way than Hezekiah could ever reflect. And as with Ahaz and Hezekiah, the nearness of God, well, that can be a source of comfort for us or a cause of distress. God is with us. He has demonstrated his commitment to being engaged in our affairs by sending his son to become one of us. All of our struggles and our doubts and our fears and our regrets, God has come to heal those, to mend those, to give us assurance. But if we, like Ahaz, spurn that gesture of God's desire for intimacy with us and turn away from him, rejecting his loving offer to bring rescue, well, he won't thereby cease to be close. He's still Immanuel. God is with us. And our stiff arm does nothing to change He'll just change the nature of that intimacy. Instead of the intimacy of a friend who's there for us, we might get the uncomfortable intimacy of a bee in our bonnet. Instead of the intimacy of a defender who fights for us, we might get the intimacy of a razor shaving us bare. Either way, God is near. He is with you. He is in your business, like it or not. His prints are all over your life. But you will decide whether that intimacy is welcomed or resisted. Whether God being near is a source of comfort or distress. Will you be Ahaz, insisting on doing it your own way? Or will you be Hezekiah, trusting God to come to your defense when all other gods have failed? Let's pray. So, Lord, that's our desire to exemplify Hezekiah's response to your nearness, not Ahaz. To be those who trust you, and in trusting you, see you bring your presence to bear on our circumstances in a way that is a profound reflection of your love and your care. So, Lord, I pray that we would submit our lives to you, and in doing so, that would be the greatest decision ever made. We would see you at work in ways that give us encouragement and hope. Give us the courage to face those things with confidence,